What George Strait did for this homeless child left everyone in tears. No one expected this ending. The winter sun was setting early over San Antonio, casting long shadows across the historic River Walk. George Strait, the undisputed king of country music, sat behind the wheel of his Ford F-150, his weathered hands tapping gently against the steering wheel as Merle Haggard played softly through the speakers. Beside him, his 12-year-old grandson Harvey fidgeted with excitement. This wasn't just any afternoon drive. George had promised to show the boy the old dance halls and dive bars where his legendary career had first taken flight 4 decades earlier. "Your grandma and I used to play at that little joint right there," George said, nodding toward a brick building with a faded neon sign. "Couldn't have been more than 50 people some nights, but they danced to every song like it was their last." Harvey pressed his face against the window, trying to imagine his grandfather, now selling out stadiums, playing in such a tiny venue. "Did you know back then that you'd be famous someday, Grandpa?" George chuckled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Son, I was just hoping to make enough to pay the rent and keep gas in the truck. Your grandma believed more than I did in those early days." As they approached downtown, traffic slowed to a crawl. The light turned red at an intersection near the Alamo, and George eased the truck to a stop. He adjusted his black resistal hat and glanced at his watch. They'd need to head back soon if they were going to make it to dinner with the family. "Grandpa, look!" Harvey's voice cracked with sudden urgency. "That boy over there. I think he needs help." George followed his grandson's pointing finger to the corner of the intersection. There, partially hidden in the shadow of a historic building, stood a small figure. A boy, no more than 8 years old, trembled in the unseasonable cold, his thin jacket offering little protection against the biting wind that occasionally gusted through the urban canyon of buildings. In his small hands, he clutched a cardboard sign with crude lettering, "Please help my family." The boy's face told a story that pierced George's heart. Hollow cheeks, dark circles under eyes that seemed too old for his young face, and a resignation that no child should ever have to bear. Yet there was something else there too, a flicker of determination that reminded George of himself as a young boy in Poteet, Texas, where he'd learned early that life rarely handed out easy breaks. "Those shoes," Harvey whispered, noticing. The boy's footwear, tattered sneakers with soles flapping loose, held together with what appeared to be packing tape. The light turned green, and horns blared behind them. George Strait, a man who had built a career on songs about life's simple truths, found himself at a crossroads that had nothing to do with traffic. With a decision that would set in motion events none of them could have anticipated, he turned on his hazard lights and pulled the truck to the curb. "Wait here a minute, Harvey," he said, but his grandson was already unbuckling his seatbelt. "I'm coming too, Grandpa," Harvey insisted with a determination that made George smile, despite the heaviness of the moment. The boy had his grandmother's heart. If you're moved by stories of compassion and unexpected kindness, be sure to like, subscribe, and share this story with others who believe in the power of helping others. As they approached the boy, George noticed how he tensed, eyes darting as if calculating whether to run. Years of meeting fans had taught the country star to approach strangers with a gentle, non-threatening demeanor, and he employed that skill now. "Howdy there," George said softly, crouching down slightly despite the protest of his knees. "Mighty cold to be standing out here today." The boy clutched his sign tighter, regarding the pair with cautious eyes. "I'm trying to help my family, sir," he replied in accented English. "My papa can't work right now." Harvey, demonstrating an emotional intelligence beyond his years, stepped forward. "I'm Harvey, and this is my grandpa. What's your name?" "Miguel," the boy answered after a moment's hesitation. "Miguel Ramirez." "You hungry, Miguel?" George asked, noting how the boy's jacket hung loosely on his small frame. Miguel's eyes widened slightly before he gave a single dignified nod. "There's a diner just down the block makes a mean cheeseburger," George suggested. "Would you like to join us? My treat." The mixture of hope and suspicion that crossed Miguel's face spoke volumes about the hard lessons life had already taught him. "I should stay here. I need to bring home money tonight." George nodded respectfully. "I understand responsibility to family. Maybe we could get something to go then, for you and your folks." Something in the sincerity of George's tone seemed to reach Miguel. "My mama is sick," he admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And my papa hurt his back at the construction site. My little brother and sister are hungry." Harvey looked up at his grandfather, his eyes pleading. George recognized that look. It was the same one he'd seen in the mirror decades ago when he'd decided to risk everything for a music career despite having a young family to support. It was the look of someone whose heart had made a decision their head couldn't ignore. "Miguel," George said, "would you trust us enough to show us where your family is staying? Maybe there's more we can do to help than just provide one meal." Miguel studied the two strangers. The tall man with the kind eyes under his cowboy hat, and the boy who seemed genuinely concerned. Something about them felt safe, different from the hundreds of people who had walked past him over the last 3 days, without sparing more than a glance. "It's not far," Miguel finally said, "just a few blocks that way." He pointed toward an area where the tourist sheen of downtown San Antonio faded into more neglected streets. As they walked back to the truck, a young woman hurried past, then stopped and turned around. "Excuse me," she said, her eyes widening. "Are you George Strait?" George offered a polite smile and tipped his hat. "Yes, ma'am." She fumbled excitedly for her phone. "Could I get a quick picture? My mom's your biggest fan." Before George could respond, Harvey stepped slightly in front of Miguel, an instinctive gesture of protection. "My grandpa's actually helping our friend right now," he said with a politeness that matched his grandfather's. "Maybe another time?" George placed a hand on Harvey's shoulder, a subtle gesture of approval. "Sorry, ma'am. Perhaps at the show next month?" The woman looked between George, Harvey, and the disheveled boy, comprehension gradually replacing disappointment. "Of course. That's really nice of you." She hesitated, then reached into her purse and extended a $20 bill toward Miguel. "Here, I want to help too." Miguel looked to George, who nodded encouragingly. The boy accepted the money with a quiet, "Thank you, ma'am." As they reached the truck, George helped Miguel into the back seat, noting how the boy's eyes widened at the leather interior and how carefully he sat, as if afraid to dirty the upholstery. "You can relax, buddy," George said, adjusting the heater to blast warm air toward the back seat. "Now, how about you direct us to your family?" Miguel guided them through a series of increasingly narrow streets, away from the tourist areas and into a neighborhood where chain-link fences surrounded small, aging homes. Eventually, he pointed to a motel with a flickering vacancy sign and peeling paint, the kind of establishment that rented rooms by the week to those who had nowhere else to go. "It's room 17, Miguel said, his voice small. "We've been here for 2 weeks since we couldn't pay rent at our apartment." George parked the truck and exchanged a look with Harvey that contained volumes of unspoken understanding. They weren't just delivering a meal anymore, they were stepping into the middle of a family's struggle for survival. Room 17 was at the far end of the single-story motel. The curtains were drawn, but a sliver of light escaped from between them. Miguel approached the door and knocked in a pattern, 3 quick taps followed by 2 slower ones. Clearly a family. A signal. The door opened cautiously, revealing a young girl of about 6 who broke into a wide smile at the sight of her brother. "Miguel!" she exclaimed, then froze when she noticed the strangers behind him. "It's okay, Lucia," Miguel assured her. "They're friends." A man appeared behind the little girl, moving slowly and wincing with the effort. Carlos Ramirez was in his mid-30s, but pain had etched deep lines around his mouth and eyes. He wore a back brace over his shirt and leaned slightly on a makeshift cane fashioned from a broomstick. His expression shifted from concern to confusion as he took in the sight of his son, accompanied by a well-dressed older man and a boy. "Miguel, who are these people?" he asked in Spanish, his tone protective rather than accusing. Before Miguel could answer, coughing erupted from inside the room, deep rattling coughs that spoke of something more serious than a common cold. Carlos's expression tightened with worry as he glanced back over his shoulder. "Sir," George said, stepping forward and removing his hat in a gesture of respect, "my name is George Strait, and this is my grandson Harvey. We met your boy downtown, and he told us about your situation. We'd like to help if you'll allow us." Carlos straightened as much as his injured back permitted, pride warring with necessity on his face. "My son shouldn't be bothering strangers. We're getting by." Miguel looked down, ashamed. "I'm sorry, Papa. I just wanted to help since you can't work right now." The coughing from inside grew more intense, followed by a woman's voice weakly calling Miguel's name. Concern overrode Carlos's hesitation, and he stepped back. "Please come in," he said quietly. "My wife, Elena, she has been sick for 2 weeks now." The motel room that greeted them told a story of desperate circumstances and dignified poverty. 2 double beds dominated the space, one where a woman lay covered in a thin blanket, her face flushed with fever. A toddler of about 3 slept beside her, thumb in mouth. A small table held the family's meager possessions, some clothes folded neatly, a few toys that had seen better days, and a collection of medicine bottles. The bathroom door stood open, revealing a makeshift kitchen where a hot plate rested on the counter next to a few canned goods and a half loaf of bread. Despite these circumstances, the room was meticulously clean, and the children, though in worn clothing, were well groomed. Elena Ramirez tried to sit up when she saw visitors, maternal dignity driving her to be a proper hostess despite her illness. "Please forgive me," she managed before another coughing fit seized her. George had seen poverty before. Growing up in a small Texas town in the 1950s, he knew what struggling looked like. But there was something about this family's quiet dignity in the face of such adversity that struck him deeply. "Mrs. Ramirez, please don't get up," George said, moving toward her with genuine concern. "Your son Miguel is quite a remarkable young man. He's been trying very hard to help your family." Elena's eyes filled with tears as she reached for Miguel's hand. "He shouldn't have to carry such burdens. He's just a boy." Harvey, who had been quietly observing, suddenly spoke up. "My mom's a nurse at Methodist Hospital," he said. "She could come look at you, Mom." George glanced at his grandson with surprise and pride. The boy had inherited not just his grandmother's heart, but her practical approach to helping others. Norma Strait had been a no-nonsense woman who believed in rolling up her sleeves when others were in need. "That's an excellent idea, Harvey," George agreed, already reaching for his phone. "If it's all right with you, Mrs. Ramirez, I'd like to call my daughter-in-law. That cough sounds like something that needs proper attention." Carlos and Elena exchanged a worried look that George immediately understood. "Please don't worry about the cost," he added gently. "Sometimes neighbors just need to help neighbors." Little Lucia tugged at George's sleeve. "Mister, are you really here to help? The man at the desk says we have to leave tomorrow because we can't pay anymore." George looked around at this family, at Carlos standing despite obvious pain, at Elena fighting illness while trying to comfort her children, at little Lucia and the sleeping toddler, and at Miguel, a child forced to grow up too quickly. In that moment, what had started as a simple act of kindness crystallized into something more for George Strait. He thought about the millions of dollars his music had earned him, about the ranch in Texas where his horses roamed free across acres. of land, about the blessed life he'd been able to provide for his own family through hard work and good fortune. "Yes, little lady," he answered Lucia, crouching down to meet her eyes. "I'm really here to help, and I promise you won't have to leave tomorrow." As Harvey watched his grandfather with admiration, neither of them could have anticipated just how deeply the Ramirez family's story would affect them, or how the events set in motion that afternoon would change not only the lives of this struggling family, but touch the hearts of thousands across Texas and beyond. What George Strait was about to do next would leave everyone in tears, and no one, least of all Miguel, could have predicted the extraordinary turn their lives were about to take. The evening drew on. The small motel room became a hub of unexpected activity. George's daughter-in-law Jennifer arrived within 40 minutes, medical bag in hand. A pediatric nurse with 15 years of experience, she moved with quiet efficiency, examining Elena with professional thoroughness while maintaining a warmth that put the nervous family at ease. "Mrs. Ramirez, you have pneumonia," Jennifer confirmed. "After listening to the woman's lungs, you need antibiotics immediately, and honestly, you should be in a hospital for observation." Elena shook her head weakly. "No hospital, too expensive. We have no insurance." Jennifer exchanged a concerned glance with George, who had been talking quietly with Carlos in the corner of the room. The two men had found common ground in their rural upbringings. Carlos had grown up on a small farm outside Guadalajara before coming to America for construction work. "Elena," George said, moving to her bedside, "getting proper care isn't optional. Jennifer says you need a hospital, and that's where you're going." Carlos stepped forward, his face etched with worry. "Mr. Strait, you don't understand. One night in the hospital would cost more than we make in a month. We already owe thousands for my back injury. The foreman said workers' compensation doesn't cover me because—" He hesitated, looking down. George understood the implication. Carlos's immigration status made him vulnerable to exploitation by unscrupulous employers. "Carlos," George said firmly, "I understand money is a concern, but your wife needs medical care. Let me handle the financial part." Miguel, who had been listening intently while keeping his younger siblings occupied, looked up with a mixture of hope and disbelief. In his young life, strangers rarely offered help without wanting something in return. Harvey noticed the boy's skepticism and moved to sit beside him. "My grandpa always keeps his promises," he said softly. "Always." While Jennifer called ahead to the hospital, George stepped outside to make a series of phone calls. First to his wife, explaining he'd be late and why. Then to his longtime friend, Dr. Robert Martinez, a respected physician who had attended the same church as the Straits for decades. Finally to his attorney, giving specific instructions about setting up the payment arrangements with the hospital. When he returned to the room, Carlos was helping Elena into a jacket, while Jennifer gently examined the toddler, now awake and fussing. "Carlos, Jennifer will drive Elena to the hospital," George explained. "Dr. Martinez will meet them there. He's one of the best doctors in San Antonio and an old friend of mine." But the children," Elena began, trying to stand despite her weakness. "The little ones can come with me," Jennifer offered. "The pediatric floor has a wonderful play area where they'll be comfortable while you're being treated." Carlos looked, torn between staying with his wife and remaining with Miguel. George sensed his dilemma. "Carlos, why don't you go with Elena? Harvey and I will bring Miguel along later, after we solve the hotel situation and get some proper food for everyone." Miguel looked up at the mention of food, revealing the hunger he'd been stoically ignoring. George noticed and felt a twinge in his chest. No child should have to hide hunger. As Jennifer helped Elena to her car with Carlos supporting her on the other side, Lucia and the toddler, whose name George learned was Raphael, followed closely. George watched them go with a thoughtful expression before turning his attention to the motel manager's office. There were matters to settle. The office was tiny and smelled of cigarettes despite the "no smoking" sign prominently displayed. Behind a scratched plexiglass barrier, a heavy-set man with thinning hair watched a small television, barely acknowledging George and Harvey when they entered. Miguel hung back near the door, clearly uncomfortable. "Evening," George said pleasantly. "I'd like to discuss room 17. The manager looked up with obvious irritation. "What about it? Those people are out tomorrow if they can't pay. Already gave them an extra day out of kindness, but business is business." George maintained his calm demeanor. "I understand. I'd like to settle their bill and extend their stay." This caught the manager's attention. He gave George a more appraising look, finally noticing the quality of his clothing and the air of quiet confidence he carried. "That'll be $490 for the week they owe, plus $350 for another week in advance." Harvey watched his grandfather carefully count out the cash, laying the bills neatly on the counter. The manager reached for the money, but George kept his hand firmly on it. "I'd also like to see a receipt, and I'd appreciate if you could arrange for fresh towels and linens for the room tonight," George added, his tone friendly but brooking no argument. The manager's demeanor shifted instantly, professional courtesy emerging now that money was on the table. "Yes, sir, right away. Will there be anything else?" George considered for a moment. "Actually, yes. Does the room have a refrigerator?" "Just the small one in the bathroom." "I see. Is there a larger unit you could move in there? These folks might be staying a while." The manager hesitated. "Well, I have one in storage from when we renovated the office, but..." George added another $100 to the stack. "Would that cover the inconvenience?" 20 minutes later, George, Harvey, and Miguel sat in a booth at a family restaurant, a few blocks from the motel. Miguel, initially hesitant to order much, now watched in wide-eyed anticipation as the waitress brought a feast to their table. Cheeseburgers, fries, chicken tenders, mashed potatoes, and milkshakes. "Go ahead, son," George encouraged. "Eat up." Miguel needed no further invitation. He ate with the focused intensity of someone who had missed too many meals, though he still maintained impeccable manners. George noticed how the boy carefully wrapped half his burger in a napkin. "That's for later?" George asked gently. Miguel nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "For Papa. He doesn't eat much when food is scarce. Says his stomach is full, but I know it's not true." Harvey, who had never experienced food insecurity in his life, watched Miguel with a new perspective dawning in his eyes. George saw his grandson's expression and felt a surge of gratitude for this unexpected lesson in empathy that no amount of parental guidance could have provided so effectively. While they ate, George asked Miguel about school. The boy's face lit up as he described his love for mathematics and reading, how his teacher had given him special advanced books before they'd had to leave their apartment. His enthusiasm dimmed when he admitted he'd missed almost 2 weeks of classes because his parents couldn't afford the bus fare and were embarrassed to tell the school they'd been evicted. "Education is too important to miss," George said thoughtfully. "We'll need to get that sorted out too." After dinner, they stopped at a supermarket. What started as a quick trip for essentials turned into a full grocery run. Harvey took charge of pushing the cart, while George and Miguel filled it with staples: rice, beans, fresh vegetables, fruit, milk, bread, and eggs. They added cleaning supplies, toiletries, and at Harvey's insistence, some treats for the younger children. The cashier raised an eyebrow at the mountain of groceries, but said nothing as George paid. In the parking lot, Miguel helped load the bags into the truck with an efficiency that spoke of someone accustomed to contributing to family responsibilities far beyond his years. Their next stop was a discount department store, where George quietly purchased clothing for the entire Ramirez family, guiding Miguel to help select sizes and styles his parents and siblings would appreciate. Miguel moved through the racks with careful consideration, selecting practical items in subdued colors, nothing flashy or attention-grabbing. "You don't want something a little more fun for yourself?" George asked, noticing the plain shirts Miguel had chosen. The boy shrugged. "These will last longer, and if they don't look too nice, the other kids don't try to steal them." Another lesson in the realities of poverty that struck George deeply. He added a few more items to their cart, a sturdy backpack, school supplies, and a set of books appropriate for Miguel's grade level. By the time they reached the hospital, their truck was filled with supplies, and George had formulated the beginnings of a plan. Harvey had been unusually quiet during their shopping expedition, observing everything with thoughtful eyes. As they parked, he finally spoke. "Grandpa, how come some people have so much and others have so little? It doesn't seem fair." George turned off the engine and faced his grandson. "That's one of life's toughest questions, Harvey, and you're right, it isn't fair. But that's why those of us who have been blessed with plenty have a responsibility to help others when we can. Like you're helping Miguel's family." "Exactly. Though between you and me, I think they're helping us just as much." Harvey considered. "This, because they're teaching us to be grateful?" George smiled at his grandson's perception. "That's part of it, but also because they remind us what truly matters: family, dignity, hard work, and kindness. Miguel's father could have sent him to beg for money, but instead that boy took it upon himself to help his family. That kind of character is something money can't buy." The pediatric floor was quieter than the busy emergency department they'd passed through. They found Carlos in a small waiting area, his face drawn with exhaustion, but showing relief when he saw them. "Elena is resting now," he reported. "The doctor says she has bacterial pneumonia and needs to stay for at least 2 days. They gave her strong antibiotics and something to help her breathe better." "That's good news," George said, sitting beside him. "Dr. Martinez is excellent. She's in good hands." Carlos nodded gratefully. "Your daughter-in-law took the little ones to get something to eat. She is very kind." He hesitated, then added in a low voice, "Mr. Strait, I don't know how to thank you, but I must tell you, I cannot pay for all this. Not the hospital, not even the motel room for another week." George waved away his concerns. "Carlos, I didn't help so you would owe me. I helped because it was the right thing to do. But I must repay somehow," Carlos insisted, his pride evident. "I am not a man who takes charity without giving something in return. Before my injury, I never missed a day of work in 6 years." George studied the younger man thoughtfully. "Tell me about your construction experience." For the next half hour, Carlos detailed his work history, starting as a laborer and advancing to skilled carpentry, masonry, and eventually site supervision on smaller projects. He spoke with obvious pride about the buildings he'd helped create across San Antonio, including renovations on some historic structures near the Alamo. "When did the doctors say you could return to work?" George asked. Carlos's expression fell. "The clinic doctor said 6 to 8 weeks minimum, but my employer has already replaced me. In construction, they cannot wait." George nodded, an idea taking shape in his mind. "Carlos, I have a ranch outside of San Antonio. There's always maintenance work that needs doing. Fences to mend, outbuildings to repair, that sort of thing. Once you're healed, would you consider working there? The position comes with a small house on the property." The look of disbelief on Carlos's face was quickly replaced by cautious hope. "You would trust me with your property. You barely know me." "I'm a pretty good judge of character," George replied. "And Miguel clearly comes from good stock." Miguel, who had been quietly listening, looked up at his father with shining eyes. Carlos placed a hand on his son's shoulder, visibly moved. "Mr. Strait, just George, please." "George, then. This is more than generosity. It is life-changing. Before George could respond, Jennifer returned with Lucia and Raphael. The little girl ran to her father, chattering excitedly about the ice cream Jennifer had bought them. Raphael, tired from the day's events, reached for Miguel, who took his little brother with practiced ease. "The nurses said we can set up a cot for Carlos in Elena's room," Jennifer reported, "and these two munchkins can stay in the pediatric ward overnight. They've got beds for parents who need to stay with their children." "What about Miguel?" Carlos asked, concerned. "I was thinking," Harvey piped up, looking to his grandfather for approval, "maybe Miguel could stay with us tonight. We've got plenty of room, and in the morning we could bring him back here." George smiled at his grandson's suggestion. "That's up to Miguel and his dad, but you're welcome if you'd like." Miguel looked torn between wanting to stay with his family and the adventure of visiting what he imagined must be an amazing home. Carlos sensed his son's conflicted feelings. "Go with them, mijo," he encouraged. "You've done so much for our family these past days. You deserve a good night's rest. In a comfortable bed, I'll take care of Lucia and Raphael here." As they said their goodbyes, Jennifer pulled George aside. "Dad, I've spoken with Elena's doctors. This didn't develop overnight. She's been sick for weeks and trying to power through it. And Carlos's back injury is worse than he's letting on. He'll need physical therapy, not just rest, if he wants to work again." George nodded solemnly. "We'll make sure they both get the care they need." Driving home with Miguel sitting wide-eyed in the back seat, George made one more call to his wife, explaining they'd have a young guest for the night. Harvey chattered excitedly, telling Miguel about the horses at the ranch and promising to show him around in the morning. George watched the boys in the rearview mirror, already falling into the easy camaraderie of childhood. Miguel's earlier wariness had given way to animated conversation as Harvey described the ranch. The contrast between Miguel's circumstances this morning and tonight couldn't have been more profound. And yet George sensed this was just the beginning of an extraordinary journey for both families. As they turned onto the long private road leading to the Strait residence, none of them could have predicted the remarkable twist of fate waiting just around the corner. A development that would test everyone's resolve and ultimately lead to a moment that would leave not just San Antonio, but the entire country in tears. As they approached the ranch, Miguel fell silent, his face pressed against the window in astonishment. The wrought iron gates opened automatically as George's truck approached, revealing a long driveway lined with oak trees. In the distance, the main house glowed with warm light, a sprawling single-story ranch home with a wide porch wrapping around its perimeter. Nearby stood a barn and several outbuildings, and beyond them, open pastures stretched into the darkness. "This is where you live," Miguel whispered, his voice filled with awe. Harvey nodded, accustomed to his grandparents' property, but seeing it anew through his friend's eyes. "Wait until you see the horses tomorrow morning." George parked near the front porch, where Norma Strait stood waiting. At 68, she remained as graceful and warm as when George had first fallen in love with her decades ago. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her welcoming smile illuminated her face when she saw the boys emerge from the truck. "You must be Miguel," she said, coming down the steps to greet him. "Harvey called earlier and told me all about you. Are you hungry? I've kept dinner warm." Miguel shook his head politely. "No, thank you, Mom. Mr. Strait and Harvey already took me for burgers. It was the biggest one I ever had." Norma laughed gently. "Well, there's homemade apple pie for dessert when you're ready. Come on in and get settled." Inside, Miguel stood in the entryway, seemingly afraid to touch anything. The house was elegant but comfortable, with Western-themed decor, family photos covering the walls, and worn leather furniture that invited relaxation. It was the home of a family that valued comfort over showcasing. Wealth Those signs of prosperity were evident in the spaciousness and quality of everything around them. "Harvey, why don't you show Miguel where he'll be sleeping and lend him some pajamas?" Norma suggested. "I put fresh towels in the guest bathroom if he'd like to shower." While the boys headed down the hallway, George filled Norma in on the full situation with the Ramirez family. Her expression grew increasingly concerned as he described Elena's condition and the family's circumstances. "Those poor dears," she said when he finished. "And that boy, standing on street corners in this weather!" And she shook her head, her practical compassion already shifting to planning mode. The guest house would be perfect for them once Elena's released from the hospital. It's just sitting empty since Bubba moved out. George nodded, having already considered this. "That's what I was thinking. It would give them breathing room to get back on their feet. Carlos can start working on the ranch once his back heals, and I've been meaning to fix up those outbuildings anyway." Norma touched her husband's arm gently. "You've always had a big heart, George. It's one of the reasons I fell in love with you." He smiled, placing his hand over hers. "These folks aren't looking for handouts. They just need a fair chance." Later that evening, after showers and generous slices of Norma's apple pie topped with vanilla ice cream, Harvey and Miguel sat in the family room watching a movie. Miguel fought to keep his eyes open, the emotional and physical exhaustion of recent days finally catching up with him now that he was warm, clean, and safe. George observed the boy from the doorway, noting how his borrowed pajamas hung loose on his thin frame. Despite his obvious fatigue, Miguel maintained perfect manners, thanking Norma each time she checked if he needed anything. There was an old soul quality to him that reminded George of growing up in a different era, when children shouldered responsibility without complaint. When Miguel finally dozed off on the couch, George carried him to the guest bedroom. The boy barely stirred as George tucked him in, murmuring something in Spanish about his parents. Standing in the doorway afterward, watching Miguel's peaceful sleep, George felt a profound sense of purpose taking root. The next morning brought crystalline Texas sunshine and the appetizing aroma of bacon and eggs. Miguel appeared in the kitchen, in doorway, hair tousled but clothes neatly straightened, hesitant to enter until Norma waved him in. "Good morning, sweetheart. Sleep well?" she asked, setting a glass of orange juice at an empty place at the table. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." He glanced around. "Can I help with anything?" Norma smiled at his eagerness to contribute. "You're our guest, Miguel. All you need to do is enjoy your breakfast." Harvey burst into the kitchen with the energy only 12-year-olds possess at 7 in the morning. "Miguel, after breakfast, I can show you the horses. Grandpa said it's okay." George entered more sedately, freshly showered after his early morning chores, dressed in worn jeans and a plaid shirt. "First breakfast, then horses," he confirmed, "and then we should get back to the hospital to check on your mama." Miguel nodded seriously. "I hope she's feeling better, and I need to tell Papa about the food we bought. He always worries about feeding everyone." During breakfast, George received a call from Jennifer with an update on Elena's condition. She was responding well to antibiotics, but would need to remain hospitalized for at least another day. Carlos had stayed by her side all night, refusing the cot the nurses had provided. "He's a devoted husband," Jennifer commented. "Barely slept a wink, kept thanking everyone who came into the room, from doctors down to the custodial staff." After breakfast, Harvey proudly gave Miguel a tour of the stables, where George kept his quarter horses, including several champions. Miguel approached the animals with cautious respect that quickly turned to wonder when one of the gentler mares nuzzled his hand. "She likes you," Harvey declared. George, watching from the stable door, added, "That's Duchess. She's an excellent judge of character." Miguel stroked the horse's nose with reverent fingers. "We had horses in Mexico, on my grandfather's farm, but I was very little then. I don't remember much." Would you like to learn to ride? George asked. Miguel's eyes widened. Really? You would teach me? Sure would. Maybe not today, but soon. When they arrived at the hospital later that morning, they found Carlos dozing uncomfortably in a chair beside Elena's bed. The younger children were being entertained by a hospital volunteer in the pediatric playroom. Elena looked markedly better than the previous day. Some color returned to her cheeks, though exhaustion still shadowed her eyes. She brightened when Miguel rushed to her side. "Mama, how are you feeling?" "Much better, mijo." She squeezed his hand, then looked up at George with profound gratitude. "Mr. Strait, I don't know how to thank you for everything." "Please, it's just George, and there's no need for thanks." He handed Carlos a set of keys. "These are for your motel room. We stocked the refrigerator with food and left some fresh clothes. In for everyone." Carlos straightened in his chair. "You've already done too much." George cut him off gently. "Neighbors helping neighbors, remember? Besides, I have a proposition for your family once Elena is discharged." "Odi." Over the next half hour, George outlined his offer: the guest house on his ranch, a maintenance job for Carlos once he recovered, assistance getting the children enrolled in school, and proper medical follow-up for Elena. He was careful to frame it in a way that preserved the family's dignity, emphasizing that Carlos's skills were genuinely needed around the property. "It's not charity," George explained. "It's an opportunity that benefits us both. Of course, once you're back on your feet, you're free to move on if you wish." Elena and Carlos exchanged looks loaded with unspoken communication. Hope, caution, pride, and pragmatism all mingling together. Finally, Carlos extended his hand. "We accept with gratitude," he said simply. "I promise you won't regret giving us this chance." What none of them realized was that a nurse standing just outside the door had overheard much of their conversation. Melissa Johnson had been a country music fan her entire life, and recognizing George Strait in her hospital had been exciting enough. But witnessing his private act of generosity, with no cameras, no publicity, nothing but genuine compassion, moved her deeply. During her lunch break, she posted a simple message on her Facebook page. "Just witness the real George Strait, not the country music legend, but the man, helping a struggling family in our hospital with incredible kindness and zero fanfare. No photos, no press. This is what real character looks like when no one's watching. Restoring my faith in inhumanity, to Jakash George the Great." By that evening, her post had been shared over 1,000 times. By the following morning, as Elena was being discharged from the hospital, local news stations were trying to confirm the story. George himself remained unaware of the brewing public interest, focused instead on helping the Ramirez family settle into the guest house on his property. The guest house, though termed modestly, was a comfortable 3-bedroom home that had originally housed George's son Bubba and his family before they built their own place nearby. Spotlessly clean and fully furnished, it represented luxury beyond the Ramirez family's wildest expectations. Lucia ran from room to room in excitement while Rafael toddled after her. Miguel stood in the living room, seeming afraid to sit on the plush sofa. Elena, still weak but improving, wept quietly at the kitchen table as she ran her fingers over the smooth countertop. "It's too beautiful," she whispered to Carlos. "We will keep it perfect for them." Carlos nodded, overwhelmed. "I've never provided something like this for you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've failed our family." Elena gripped his hand fiercely. "No, you worked until your body broke. That's not failure." Over the next few days, a routine began to establish itself. Jennifer checked on Elena daily, monitoring her recovery. Norma took Lucia and Rafael under her wing, reading them stories and teaching Lucia to bake cookies. Harvey and Miguel became inseparable, with Harvey introducing Miguel to his video games and Miguel teaching Harvey Spanish words in return. George drove Miguel to his old school to withdraw him and get his records transferred to the school nearest the ranch. The principal, upon learning the situation, pulled George aside. "Mr. Strait, I should tell you that Miguel is exceptionally bright. His standardized test scores were among the highest in the district, despite English being his second language. His previous teacher recommended him for the gifted program, but unfortunately, due to his family's unstable housing situation, the paperwork was never completed." George absorbed this information thoughtfully. What would it take to get that process started again? By the end of the week, George had arranged enrollment for all 3 Ramirez children in the local schools, with Miguel placed in advanced classes. He'd also hired a physical therapist to work with Carlos at the ranch 3 times weekly, accelerating his recovery. Carlos, despite his back pain, insisted on doing whatever work he could manage. George found him one morning carefully polishing the tack in the stable, his movements slow but meticulous. "You should be resting," George admonished gently. Carlos shook his head. "Idle hands are the devil's workshop," my father always said, "and I need to earn my keep." "You're healing. That's your job right now." Carlos looked up, his expression serious. "Mr. Strait, George, may I speak honestly?" "Always." "What you've done for my family, it's not just help, it's dignity. When we lost our apartment, when I couldn't work, the worst part wasn't the pain or even the hunger. It was looking into my children's eyes and seeing that they knew I couldn't protect them anymore." His voice thickened. "For a man, there is no deeper shame." George sat down on a nearby stool, sensing the importance of this conversation. "I understand that, more than you might think." Carlos continued, "In Mexico, I had a good job as a foreman. I had respect. But here, I've been just another pair of hands, disposable when broken. Until now," he gestured around him, "here, you treat me like a man of value. My children see this. It changes how they see me and how they see themselves." "You are a man of value, Carlos," George said firmly. "Any fool can see that." In that moment, a bond formed between the 2 men that transcended their different backgrounds, a recognition of shared values and mutual respect. Meanwhile, the social media post about George's good deed had evolved into a full-fledged human interest story. Local news picked it up first, then national outlets. Reporters began calling George's management team, seeking interviews and details. George declined all requests, uncomfortable with publicity for what he considered a private matter. This only increased public fascination with the story, and speculation ran rampant. Some accounts exaggerated the situation, claiming George had adopted homeless children or built a mansion for a destitute family. 10 days after Elena's discharge from the hospital, George received a call from his longtime friend and fellow country music star, Reba McEntire. "George Strait, you big-hearted fool," she greeted him affectionately. "Have you seen the news lately?" "Can't say that I have," he replied. "Been busy around the ranch." "Well, you're all over it. Country legend's secret act of kindness. They're calling you George the Great on Twitter." George sighed. "It's nobody's business what a man does to help his neighbors." "That's exactly why people are so touched," Reba said, "because you didn't do it for attention. But now that the cat's out of the bag, you might consider channeling all this goodwill towards something constructive." "What do you mean?" "I mean, there are thousands of families like your new friends out there, good people who just need a helping hand. This could be a chance to inspire others to step up." After hanging up, George sat on his porch, contemplating Reba's words as he watched Miguel and Harvey playing catch in the yard. Carlos was nearby, showing Lucia how to plant flowers in one of Norma's garden beds, moving carefully but with increasing strength. What had begun as a simple act of kindness, inspired by his grandson's compassion, had blossomed into something much larger than George had anticipated. And as he observed these two families, one wealthy, one formerly destitute, becoming inextricably intertwined, he realized that an extraordinary opportunity was emerging. But George Strait had no idea that the most remarkable chapter of this story was yet to unfold, a development that would soon leave an entire concert audience in tears and launch a movement that would eventually change thousands of lives across Texas. As spring arrived in Texas, bringing bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush to the ranch's pastures, the transformation in the Ramirez family was remarkable. Elena had fully recovered from her pneumonia, regaining her strength and natural vivacity. Carlos walked straighter now, the combination of proper medical care and regular physical therapy allowing him to gradually increase his work around the property. The children thrived in their new environment. Lucia and Rafael played freely outdoors, their laughter becoming a familiar sound around the ranch. Miguel, however, underwent perhaps the most profound change. With proper nutrition, his thin frame filled out, and the perpetual worry that had aged his young face melted away. In school, he excelled beyond expectations, his natural intelligence flourishing now that basic survival was no longer his primary concern. George often found Miguel in the ranch's small library, devouring books on everything from astronomy to history. One evening, he discovered the boy surrounded by books about engineering and architecture. "Pretty advanced reading for someone your age," George remarked, picking up a volume on structural design. Miguel looked up with bright eyes. "I want to learn how to build things that last, like my papa does, but bigger things, buildings, bridges, maybe even skyscrapers someday." George sat down beside him. "That's a fine ambition. Takes a lot of schooling, though." "I know," Miguel replied solemnly. "University and everything. Papa says education is the one thing nobody can take from you once you have it." "Your papa is a wise man," George agreed, "and he's right about that." The Ramirez family maintained their impeccable dignity throughout their improving circumstances. Elena kept the guest house spotless and insisted on cooking traditional Mexican meals for both families several times a week. Carlos, as his back improved, worked tirelessly around the ranch, restoring outbuildings and mending fences with craftsmanship that surpassed George's expectations. "Your daddy taught you well," George commented one day, admiring Carlos's handiwork on a restored barn door. Carlos nodded, pride evident in his bearing. "He built furniture that people would save for years to buy. He always said, 'When you build something, build it to outlast yourself.'" Despite their contentment at the ranch, both Carlos and Elena were determined to regain their complete independence. They saved every dollar of Carlos's wages, planning for an eventual move back to their own place. George respected their pride too much to discourage this, though secretly he and Norma had grown attached to the family and would miss them terribly when they left. Meanwhile, the story of George Strait's intervention in the Ramirez family's life continued to circulate, evolving with each retelling. His refusal to give interviews on the subject only fueled public curiosity. Fan mail poured in, much of it containing stories from people who had experienced similar hardships and either received unexpected help or wished they had. George's manager, Frank, called one afternoon in mid-April. "George, I know you're trying to keep this private, but the public interest isn't dying down. You've got a concert in Houston next month that sold out in hours, partly because of this story." George sighed, leaning against the porch railing. "People should just come for the music." "They will," Frank assured him. "But they're also coming, because this reminded them who you are beyond the music. Listeners to life more than just a song." That evening, as the two families shared dinner on the sprawling back patio, Harvey made an innocent suggestion that would ultimately change everything. And Grandpa, remember how you sometimes invite people on stage at your concerts? Harvey asked, passing the bowl of mashed potatoes to Miguel. George nodded. Sure, for special occasions. What if Miguel and his family came to your Houston concert? Maybe they could just wave to everyone so people could see they're doing well now? An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. The Ramirez family looked mortified at the suggestion of public display. "Oh no, that wouldn't be appropriate," Elena said quickly. "What Mr. Strait has done for us is private. We would never want to make a spectacle." George raised a hand gently. "No one's going to make you do anything you're uncomfortable with, Elena. That's not our way." But later that night, as he and Norma prepared for bed, George found himself contemplating Harvey's suggestion from a different angle. What if it's not about displaying the Ramirez family, but about inspiring others, he mused. Reba mentioned something similar, using this attention to help more families in similar situations. Norma considered this as she brushed her hair. "You've always shied away from causes and spotlights when you're not performing." "I have," he acknowledged. "Maybe that was a mistake." The next day, George had a long conversation with Carlos and Elena, explaining a possibility that had been forming in his mind. They listened intently, initially hesitant but gradually warming to his vision. "It would be entirely your choice," George emphasized. "No cameras, no interviews, nothing that would make you uncomfortable. Just a brief moment to help others who are facing what you faced." Carlos looked at Elena, their unspoken communication evident. Finally, he turned back to George. "If our story can help other families find hope, then yes. But Miguel decides. For himself, he's old enough." Miguel, when consulted, showed wisdom beyond his years. "If I had seen someone like me get help, maybe I wouldn't have been so scared to ask for it myself," he reasoned. "I want to do this." In the weeks leading up to the Houston concert, George worked quietly with his management team and several trusted business associates to establish the foundation for something new. He contacted county officials, social workers, and community organizers across Texas, gathering information about families in situations similar to what the Ramirezes had faced. Jennifer, whose work as a pediatric nurse had shown her the health care challenges facing low-income families, became an enthusiastic participant in the planning. "It's not just medical care they need," she explained during a family dinner. "It's stability, dignity, and opportunity, exactly what you've provided." For Miguel's family, the night of the Houston concert arrived, warm and clear with stars punctuating the Texas sky. Backstage at the NUG Stadium, the Ramirez family waited nervously in a private room, dressed in new clothes that Elena had insisted on paying for herself, using money Carlos had earned at the ranch. Miguel fidgeted with his tie. "What if people don't care about our story?" George, adjusting his own cowboy hat before heading to stage, crouched down to eye level with the boy. "Miguel, remember when we first met? You were standing on that corner, not for yourself, but for your family. That kind of courage and love always matters to good people, and Texas is full of good people." The concert proceeded normally for the first hour and a half, with George performing his beloved classics to thunderous applause. Vans sang along to Amarillo by Morning and The Chair, many unaware of the moment that was coming. As the night drew toward its conclusion, George stepped to the microphone during a quiet moment between songs. "You know, for 40 years I've been blessed to sing for the best fans in the world," he began, his voice echoing through the stadium. "And I've always believed that music has the power to change lives. But sometimes it's not the music that changes things. Sometimes it's the people we meet along the way." A hush fell over the audience as George recounted the story of a cold afternoon in San Antonio, a young boy on a street corner, and a simple decision to stop and help. He spoke of Harvey's compassion, of Miguel's determination to save his family, and of the dignity with which Carlos and Elena had faced overwhelming adversity. "Tonight, I'd like you to meet this remarkable family," George said, gesturing to the side of the stage. Carlos, Elena, Miguel, Lucia, and Rafael walked out slowly, blinking in the bright lights. The audience erupted in applause, many rising to their feet. Miguel stood tall beside his father, his expression serious but proud. Elena held Rafael in her arms, while Lucia clung to her skirt, overwhelmed by the massive crowd. "This family taught me something important," George continued. "When the applause subsided, they taught me that sometimes the difference between despair and hope is simply one person stopping to help, one person saying, 'I see you, you matter.'" He turned to address the Ramirez family directly. "Miguel, the day we met, you weren't asking for help for yourself. You were standing on that corner for your family. That kind of courage deserves more than just a helping hand. It deserves a chance to build a future." George turned back to the audience. "That's why tonight I'm announcing the creation of the Strait Path Foundation. Starting here in Texas, we'll be identifying hard-working families caught in desperate circumstances through no fault of their own. Folks who just need a temporary bridge to get back on solid ground." The crowd's applause swelled again, but George wasn't finished. "And to start this foundation off right, I'm personally pledging $1 million tonight. Because neighbors help neighbors in Texas. That's just how we do things here." What happened next would be described in dozens of news stories and thousands of social media posts in the days that followed. Miguel stepped forward and whispered something to George, who smiled and nodded, handing the boy the microphone. Miguel stared out at the sea of faces, momentarily frozen. Then, in a clear voice that grew stronger with each word, he spoke. "My name is Miguel Ramirez. 2 months ago, I was standing on a street corner believing my family had no future. Today, I'm standing here believing I can become an engineer someday." He paused, gathering his courage. "Mr. Strait didn't just help my family. He showed me that where you start doesn't have to be where you end up. And he showed me that good people are everywhere. You just have to be brave enough to ask for help when you need it." As Miguel handed the microphone back, there wasn't a dry eye in the stadium. The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. George embraced the boy, and in that moment, captured by the stadium's big screens, the image of the country legend and the former homeless child became a symbol that would inspire thousands across the country. Backstage afterward, reporter Cynthia Martinez from the Houston Chronicle approached George. "Mr. Strait, you've carefully guarded your privacy throughout your career. What made you decide to go public with this story now?" George considered the question carefully. "It wasn't my story to tell at first. It belonged to the Ramirez family. But they agreed that sharing it might help others in similar situations. And the foundation, this is new territory for you." "It is," George acknowledged, "but sometimes life puts you where you need to be, even if it's not where you plan to go." He nodded toward Miguel, who was surrounded by George's band members, all eager to meet the boy whose courage had inspired their boss. "That young man over there reminded me that blessings aren't just for keeping, they're for sharing." In the days following the concert, the Strait Path Foundation was flooded with donations from fans, fellow country artists, and corporations touched by the story. More importantly, social service agencies across Texas began referring struggling families similar to the Ramirez's. Hard-working people temporarily derailed by illness, injury, or other circumstances beyond their control. Carlos, recovering his strength more each day, approached George one morning as they inspected a fence line on the ranch's perimeter. "I've been thinking about your foundation," Carlos said, carefully selecting his words. "Perhaps I could help. I know construction, and I know what families like mine need most." George studied him thoughtfully. "What did you have in mind?" Many families need what you gave us, a temporary safe place while they rebuild their lives. I could help assess repairs needed for donated houses, maybe even lead teams of volunteers to fix them up. George clapped him on the shoulder. Carlos, you just solved a problem we've been discussing all week. We've had 3 properties donated already, but need someone who understands construction to evaluate them and coordinate renovations. Carlos's eyes lit up. I could do that. I would be honored. As spring turned to summer, the foundation took shape around a simple model inspired by the Ramirez family's experience. Provide temporary housing, medical care, employment assistance, and educational support for children. The goal wasn't permanent charity, but a bridge back to self-sufficiency. Miguel became an unofficial ambassador, speaking to school groups about resilience and the importance of education. His advanced placement teachers marveled at both his academic abilities and his emotional intelligence. When asked about his future, he no longer spoke tentatively, but with quiet confidence about his plans to study engineering. One evening in late June, George found Miguel sitting on the ranch's main porch, staring at the sunset with an introspective expression. "Penny for your thoughts?" George asked, settling into a rocking chair beside him. Miguel seemed to consider his words carefully before responding. "I was just thinking about how everything changed because Harvey saw me that day. Not just looked at me, but really saw me." George nodded. "My grandson has a good heart. Everyone passes by people like I was," Miguel continued. "They look away because it's easier, but Harvey looked right at me." He turned to George, his expression earnest. "Do you think I can be like that? Someone who really sees people who need help?" "I think you already are," George replied. "And I think you're going to help change a lot of lives someday." Neither of them could have predicted just how prophetic those words would prove to be, or how Miguel's journey was about to take another extraordinary turn, one that would not only change his own life forever, but would eventually impact thousands of others across America. As the cicadas sang in the gathering Texas dusk, the foundation for something truly remarkable was being laid, brick by brick, heart by heart. And at its center stood an unlikely partnership between a country music legend and a boy who at once had nothing but courage and love for his family to offer the world. The greatest part of their story, however, was still waiting to unfold, a development so unexpected and profound that it would one day become the subject of documentaries, books, and countless inspirational speeches. But for now, in the warm glow of a Texas sunset, it remained an unwritten chapter in an already extraordinary tale. The Strait Path Foundation's first year exceeded all expectations. What had begun as a simple act of kindness on a San Antonio street corner had blossomed into an organization that helped more than 50 families across Texas regain their footing after devastating setbacks. Carlos Ramirez, fully recovered from his back injury, had become an invaluable asset to the foundation, overseeing the renovation of donated properties and personally mentoring other immigrant workers trying to establish themselves in the construction industry. The media's interest in George Strait's philanthropic venture eventually waned, as all news cycles do, but the foundation's work continued steadily. George preferred it this way, the spotlight returning to his music while the foundation operated with quiet efficiency behind the scenes. Still, enough public awareness remained that donations continued to flow in, allowing the foundation to expand its reach beyond San Antonio to Houston, Dallas, and other Texas cities. Through it all, Miguel remained at the heart of the story. Now 14, he had sprouted several inches and carried himself with a quiet confidence that impressed everyone he met. His academic achievements had earned him a prestigious scholarship to San Antonio's top college preparatory school, where he excelled, despite being one of the few Hispanic students from a working-class background. It's strange sometimes, Miguel confided to Harvey during one of their regular weekend hangouts at the ranch. Most of the kids at my new school have never worried about food or losing their home. They complain about things I can't even imagine complaining about. Harvey, now 15 and beginning to show the lanky height of the straight men, nodded thoughtfully. Does it make you mad? Miguel considered the question. Not mad exactly. Just aware, like we live in different worlds sometimes, even though we sit at the same lunch tables. But Miguel's intelligence, coupled with his unique life experience, made him a bridge builder. He moved effortlessly between worlds, from the rarefied air of his private school to the Foundation's community events, where he spoke to families facing challenges similar to those his own family had overcome. The Ramirez family had long since moved from George's guest house to a modest but comfortable home of their own, purchased with Carlos's savings from his work and a low-interest loan arranged through the Foundation. True to their character, they had insisted on this arrangement rather than accepting a gifted property, though George had certainly offered. We want our children to see that we rebuilt our lives through work and perseverance, Carlos had explained. Your help gave us the opportunity, but we need to walk the path ourselves. The families remain deeply connected, despite no longer sharing daily life on the ranch. Sunday dinners alternated between the Strait and Ramirez homes, and Miguel still spent many weekends at the ranch, where George had made good on his promise to teach both Miguel and Harvey to ride. It was during one such weekend, nearly 2 years after their first meeting, that George received a phone call that would set in motion the next remarkable chapter in their shared story. George Strait, came a familiar voice when he answered. It's Tim McGraw. Got a minute? Always got time for you, Tim, George replied, stepping onto the porch for privacy. I've been watching what you've been doing with that foundation of yours, McGraw said. Pretty impressive stuff. Just neighbors helping neighbors, George demurred. Well, Faith and I have been talking and we'd like to do something similar. In Nashville, there's a real need here, and your model makes a lot of sense. Would you be willing to share your blueprint? By the time George ended the call 45 minutes later, the seeds had been planted for what would eventually become a network of similar foundations across multiple cities, each spearheaded by different country music artists, but operating on the principles George had established. The straight path would indeed reach far beyond Texas. That evening, as the sunset painted the sky in spectacular oranges and purples, George found Miguel in the stable, carefully grooming Duchess, the same mare that had first welcomed him to the ranch. You've got a real way with her, George observed. She doesn't let just anyone brush her like that, Miguel smiled, patting the horse's neck affectionately. She knows I respect her. George leaned against the stall door. Miguel, I've got something I'd like to discuss with you. A pretty important opportunity. The boy looked up with interest. What kind of opportunity? Tim McGraw called today. He and Faith Hill want to start a foundation like ours in Nashville. They've invited me to come speak at a fundraising event they're organizing, Share Our Story. I'd like you to come with me. Miguel's eyes widened. To Nashville, really? Really, you're as much a part of this story as I am. Maybe more. I think people need to hear from you directly, how education and opportunity have changed your path. When would we go? Next month, we'd make a proper trip of it, tour the Grand Ole Opry, visit some studios, maybe even get you in a recording booth to see how it all works. George smiled. Harvey's coming too, of course. Miguel's expression grew serious. Mr. Strait, do you think our foundation could really spread to other cities? Help more families like mine? I do. In fact, I'm counting on it. George regarded the young man thoughtfully. You know, when Harvey first spotted you on that street corner, I had no idea where that simple decision to stop would lead. But I'm starting to think it might be the most important thing I've ever done, more important than any song I've recorded, or any award I've won. Miguel set down the brush and faced George fully. My papa says that God puts people in our path for a reason. That day you were put in mine, but maybe I was put in yours too. George nodded slowly. I believe you were, son. I surely believe you were. The Nashville event exceeded all expectations. Held at the historic Ryman Auditorium, the fundraiser attracted a who's who of country music royalty. Tim and Faith hosted, with surprise performances from Garth Brooks, Trisha Yearwood, Brad Paisley, and Carrie Underwood. But the highlight of the evening came when George Strait took the stage, accompanied not by his ace in the whole band, but by Miguel Ramirez. George kept his remarks brief, explaining the Foundation's mission and its successes. Then he introduced Miguel, stepping back to give the teenager the microphone. In a voice that had deepened over the past 2 years, but still carried the sincerity that had moved 60,000 people in Houston, Miguel told his story. He spoke without notes, from the heart, about standing on that street corner in the cold, about the desperation his family had faced, and about the transformative power of being seen, truly seen, by someone willing to help. He talked about education as the bridge to opportunity, and about his dream of becoming an engineer who would design buildings to withstand natural disasters in vulnerable communities. Where I come from originally, in Mexico, many people die when earthquakes hit because the buildings aren't constructed properly, Miguel explained. I want to change that. I want to build things that protect people who can't protect themselves. When he finished speaking, the audience rose in a unanimous standing ovation. Tears flowed freely from hardened music industry veterans and newcomers alike. Backstage afterward, a parade of country stars came to shake Miguel's hand, many pressing business cards into his palm with offers of support for his educational goals. Keith Urban pulled George aside. That young man is special, George, really special. Don't I know it? George agreed proudly. What neither George nor Miguel could have anticipated was the presence of Dr. Elena Vasquez in the audience that night. The renowned structural engineer and professor at Vanderbilt University's School of Engineering had attended as a favor to a friend in the music industry. By the time Miguel finished speaking, she had already decided to reach out to him. The following morning, at the hotel where George and the boys were staying, a message arrived requesting a meeting with Miguel. Curious, George accompanied Miguel and Harvey to the hotel's restaurant, where Dr. Vasquez waited. Miguel, she said after introductions were made, your speech last night moved me deeply. I grew up in similar circumstances in Guatemala before. Coming to the United States for my education, Miguel listened attentively as she continued. I run a special mentorship program at Vanderbilt for promising Latino students interested in engineering, particularly those focused on disaster-resistant construction. I'd like to offer you a place in our summer program for high school students. It would be a 2-week immersive experience, all expenses paid. And if you decide to attend Vanderbilt after graduation, I can promise you there will be significant scholarship opportunities. Miguel looked at George, stunned. George nodded encouragingly. It's your decision, Miguel. Sounds like an amazing opportunity. Turning back to Dr. Vasquez, Miguel found his voice. I would be honored, Doctor. Thank you for this chance. As they left Nashville the next day, flying back to Texas on George's private plane, Harvey nudged Miguel. You're going to be famous one day, you know. Probably more famous than Grandpa. Miguel laughed. Nobody's more famous than your Grandpa. From the front of the plane, George called back, Fame's not what matters, boys. It's what you do with the opportunities you're given that counts. Over the next 4 years, Miguel's path continued its remarkable trajectory. The summer program at Vanderbilt led to ongoing mentorship from Dr. Vasquez. Miguel graduated at the top of his high school class, earning a full scholarship to Vanderbilt School of Engineering. His parents, bursting with pride, attended his high school graduation ceremony alongside the Strait family. The two families now permanently bonded by shared history and genuine affection. Carlos had become the foundation's construction director, overseeing projects across Texas and consulting on the new affiliate foundations emerging in Nashville, Los Angeles, and Atlanta. Elena worked as the foundation's outreach coordinator to Hispanic communities, helping identify families in need and ensuring cultural sensitivity in all the foundation's efforts. Lucia and Rafael thrived in school, following their big brother's example of academic excellence. The family's economic situation had stabilized, with Carlos's position providing steady income and benefits, and their modest home becoming a gathering place for community celebrations. 6 years to the day after Harvey first spotted Miguel on that San Antonio street corner, George Strait performed a special benefit concert for the foundation, which had by then helped more than 500 families nationwide. Backstage before the show, he presented Miguel, now 20 and home from college for summer break, with a surprise. "This came for you today," George said, handing over an official-looking envelope bearing Vanderbilt University's logo. Miguel opened it with careful fingers, read the contents, and looked up with stunned eyes. "They've accepted my design. They're actually going to build it." The letter confirmed that Miguel's innovative design for a low-cost, earthquake-resistant community center had been selected for construction in a rural Guatemalan village as part of Vanderbilt's engineering outreach program. Miguel would oversee the project himself the following summer. "I'm not surprised," George said, squeezing Miguel's shoulder, "not even a little bit." That night, George invited Miguel on stage during the concert's encore. As the spotlight found them both, George addressed the cheering crowd. "Folks, 6 years ago, my grandson spotted a brave young man standing on a street corner in the cold. Today, that young man is creating buildings that will save lives in communities that have been forgotten by most of the world." He turned to Miguel. "I've lived long enough to know that sometimes the greatest songs aren't the ones we sing on stages like this. They're the ones we live every day when we choose to see each other's humanity. Miguel, your song is just beginning, but it's already one of the most beautiful I've ever heard." As the audience applauded, Miguel embraced the man who had changed his family's destiny. No words were necessary between them. The journey they had traveled together spoke volumes. Later that evening, after the concert, the expanded Strait and Ramirez families gathered at George's ranch for a celebration. Under a canopy of Texas stars, with children playing on the lawn and adults sharing stories on the porch, George took a moment to stand apart and observe the scene. Norma joined him, slipping her hand into his. "Penny for your thoughts, cowboy?" George smiled, watching as Harvey and Miguel stood side by side, two young men now, laughing at some shared joke. "I was just thinking that Harvey was right all along." "About what?" "About stopping that day. About how important it was to help that boy." He shook his head in wonderment. Who would have thought that one small decision would lead to all this? Norma leaned against his shoulder. "That's how the most important things often happen, isn't it? Not with grand plans, but with simple choices to do the right thing in a single moment." As if sensing they were talking about him, Miguel looked up and caught George's eye across the yard. The young man raised his glass in a silent toast, a gesture George returned with profound gratitude. What had begun as one family helping another had evolved into something far greater, a movement of compassion that continued to ripple outward in ever-widening circles. And at its heart remained the simple truth Miguel had articulated years before. Sometimes all it takes to change a life is for someone to truly see you, to recognize your humanity, and to extend a hand when you need it most. George Strait, legendary, king of country music, had given the world countless hit songs throughout his storied career. But as he stood watching the young man who had once been a desperate child on a street corner, now a confident university student designing buildings to save lives, he knew that this perhaps was his greatest hit of all. The kind of hit that would play on not through radio stations or streaming services, but through changed lives and renewed hope for generations to come.